Growing up, I thought I had the perfect family. No. We lived in a nice house in a small town with my younger brother and sister, and my parents both working cushy office jobs. Some kids talked about their parents arguing or how they were divorcing, but mine were still annoyingly in love with each other. They seemed actually boring too. I remember when I was 13, my friend's dad had a bit of a midlife crisis and bought a motorcycle. Another one went off with his friends to the Himalayas to climb some mountains and came back all tanned with souvenirs and photos. But my dad liked doing the same thing week in and week out. He'd work 7 until 7, including his commute, 5 days a week. Then it would be sports on Saturday, dinner on Sunday, and then he'd do it all over again Monday to Friday. He had a lot of friends. People from work or people from college, with me and my siblings getting to know 1 or 2 of them pretty well. Now there was one guy, whose name was Carl, who me and my sister nicknamed Carl with the funny shoes. This was down to him wearing a pair of fancy suede boots in a shade of deep purple, and with him being such a nice guy and so close to my dad, we all grew to love him very much, and then one day, we got some bad news. Carl had passed away, and not of natural causes or a disease. He'd been murdered. Now, we didn't find out until years later when Mom and Dad figured that it was time to tell us what actually happened to Carl and why it had all been so hard on everyone. Carl had been walking home from the bar one night, a local that he visited maybe 4 or 5 times a week, when someone had tried to mug him at knife point. Now, most likely being drunk, probably very drunk too, Carl either didn't see the knife or decided to be a bit brave. Now, he tried to fight the mugger, and this guy stabbed him and took his stuff away, and then by the time he managed to get himself up, it was just too late. And that's why it was so hard on Carl's family, not to mention my dad, whenever the anniversary of his death came around. It wasn't just a case of mourning his loss, it was remembering how he'd been snatched away from everyone, and so needlessly too. Mom told me Dad had been involved in a campaign to try and bring Carl's murderer to justice through things like public appeals and vigils and stuff like that. So supposing they wouldn't be able to shield us from it for very much longer, they decided that it was time to tell us about it. It was the first serious tragedy I'd ever been a part of by that point. All my grandparents were still alive, and we didn't even have a goldfish that had passed away in the house, let alone a dog or a cat, of which we had both. Carl's sudden death was hard enough on us kids, but finding out someone had killed him, that traumatized us in the exact way our parents feared it would. I remember walking around feeling like a big black cloud was following me around, just these near incessant thoughts of, how can people be so evil to each other? But time heals all things, as they say, and eventually the sadness faded into the background. And slowly but surely, things got back to something approaching normal. And then by the time I was 17, talk of me going off to school was in the air, and I was very excited about it. I was on course to getting all A's and B's, which would secure me a place in my first choice of college, and the worst thing on the horizon was the prospect of saying goodbye to my current school friends. I was actually really anxious about it. We'd said that we'd keep in touch and that we'd always be friends, but I think I knew in my heart of hearts that we'd end up drifting apart, and it just made me sad. But then suddenly, and from completely out of the blue, something a million times worse reared its ugly head. I remember the night Dad didn't come home from work. When I asked Mom where he was, she said that he was on a birthday night out in the city with a few of his friends, and then since he was staying overnight in a hotel, they wouldn't be back until the afternoon the next day. I just said, oh, okay, then went about my evening, completely unaware that Mom was secretly in complete panic. Because she had absolutely no idea where he was, and he wasn't answering his phone either. It wasn't until the next day that a police officer knocked on our door to tell us what had happened, and he wasn't alone either. There was a whole team of officers with him, ready to search our house from top to bottom for evidence. And obviously the only question on my mind was, evidence of what? While the police searched the ground floor, Mom made us stay upstairs in our rooms, and it was then that she found out that Dad had been arrested. The police told Mom that Dad had been arrested at work the previous day, and for a lot of different things too, but all the charges boiled down to 2 things: First, Dad was accused of trafficking Schedule I narcotics into the country on a massive scale. And secondly, Dad was being accused of conspiracy to commit murder. Mom couldn't believe her ears, and she never truly believed it until maybe the second or third time she spoke to my dad. The first time he denied everything and said it was all just a case of mistaken identity. But then I suppose after his lawyers told him just how messed up he was, the jig was up and he had to admit it. You see, despite looking pretty boring, my dad had something of a secret identity. He went by a certain username on something called Enam, which is or was like an encrypted messaging or phone service used by all kinds of very dodgy characters. He was known by this username to all kinds of people across the country who only knew him by that name and very little else about him. And to them, he was a man that could have pretty much any kind of narcotic delivered to them and practically to their doorstep too, like a literal Amazon for drug dealers. He'd been doing it for years too, stashing away the money in some account my mom didn't know about, and she didn't search his office like the police did, and why would she? She trusted this man to tell her everything. But even with how bad all the drug stuff was, it didn't shock Mom anywhere near as much as the conspiracy to murder, and mostly because of who it involved. At the time, I thought conspiracy to murder was only when someone hadn't been killed yet and the potential killers were only in the planning stages. But it also applies in retrospect too, and if the police can prove someone had a hand in the planning of someone's murder, they're charged with said conspiracy. Well, after decrypting these messages, the police found that Dad did truly have a hand in someone's murder. That of his business partner, after a mutual associate suspected him of skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of their arrangements. And that business partner was Carl with the funny shoes. His death hadn't been a robbery gone wrong. It had been bought and paid for by my dad and the people he did business with after they secured concrete proof that Carl had been stealing. I can't blame my dad for being angry, but having him killed, words can't explain how that felt for us. I'd watched my dad at Carl's funeral, hugging his family members and consoling his wife, and I know I was only young, but never once did I suspect him of feeling anything other than genuine grief. Mom thinks Dad was a psychopath, maybe a clinical kind, that learned how to mimic human emotion even though the only person he really cared about was himself. To her, that's the only thing that explained why he was okay with planning the murder of his best friend, or one of his best friends anyway. But sometimes I suspect it was more than just a case of get rid of Carl. I think the reason Dad was able to do what he did was because his own life was under threat, maybe even ours too, if the people he worked with were willing to go even further to stop the theft. I think it was a case of them saying, the best way to prove that you weren't in on it is to help us get rid of the thief. And so, that's what Dad did. He never admitted it to my mother, not like face to face anyway, so I don't think she ever fully believed it until she watched him plead guilty. That was the only way to get a sentence under 20 years, to plead guilty, guilty, guilty to everything that was thrown at him, and then off he went to prison, which is where he's been ever since. Mom went to visit him a few times in the beginning, but it never went well. I tried and go see him myself once, but he didn't turn up, and apparently he told the guards that he couldn't do it, and I'm assuming couldn't do it was just short for couldn't look me in the eyes and admit what he'd done. He gets out right now in less than 18 months now, and it's been on my mind, and I suppose that's why I finally got around to writing this and sending it in. I know people aren't shy about letting their thoughts known in the comments too on your channel, so maybe some of your listeners and viewers can offer some advice on what to do and think and maybe even feel about it. I know I want to have some kind of familial relationship with him. He's the only dad I've got after all, but I just can't see myself forgiving him for what he had done to Carl, or the danger he put our whole family in during that time that he held a very secret identity. I grew up in Melbourne, Australia, and it's safe to say my childhood was quite a rough one. I don't want to give you the whole sob story, that's not what this is about, but I went from an unhappy kid to an unhappy teenager And then I got addicted to heroin. And the only thing that made me unhappy then was not having any heroin. I didn't need to swallow my pride to start robbing houses. I didn't have any left by the time that I'd run out of things to sell. I was a 26-year-old man with nothing to lose but my life and my freedom, and since neither really mattered to me anymore, I took every available opportunity to make some cash. Like this one time when a junkie mate of mine sniffed out a potential score while mooching off his brother-in-law. He'd been up to his old tricks while staying with his sister and her husband because after he'd found out his brother-in-law worked in gold, he went sneaking off into his office while they were out to see if he could find any. There obviously weren't any gold bars sitting around this bloke's desk, but junkies don't give up easily, so he went through this guy's entire setup before he came across something useful. And was it ever? He found a list of gold shipments to private citizens all over Australia, and it took him on a bit of a roller coaster. At first, he thinks he's onto something, but when he sees how small all the amounts are, he realizes it's not worth to burgle an entire house over such a small amount. But as he's reading, he's realizing something. About 24 of the smaller amounts listed had all gone to the same address, and all in the space of the last 18 months or so. He does a little bit of mental maths and then realizes that there might well be about $2,000 dues worth of gold stashed away in this guy's house somewhere, and that is worth the risk. The only problem is, he's putting on the Reformed Junkie Act over at his sister's and can't slip off for a whole night without breaching the little drug-free arrangement they had going on. So in exchange for a small cut of the loot, he was willing to give me the address so I could burgle the place. I agreed. He gave me the address, and then off I went to case the place. But for 2 days straight, I didn't see this guy leave or come home at all. I ended up putting on the last of my respectable-looking clothes, knocking on the door of his neighbor, and then selling him some story about trying to buy a car from him, and him not answering my calls. And that's when I found out that the bloke was on holiday and that he was back in exactly 3 days' time. Now I was thinking, no problemo, gives me plenty of time to get the job done. And then that night, I broke in with another junkie mate of mine since he had all the know-how about disabling burglar alarms. Now, we're not just there for the gold. We're looking for just about anything we can sell. But the gold took priority, and after a thorough search of the bloke's bedroom, we found a wall safe behind a nightstand. My mate brought a drill with him, and he'd handled a lot of wall safes before, so it was no drama to drill the lock and get her open. And then once we did, there she was. I didn't really know what 2 grand's worth of gold looked like until that moment. I thought that it'd be a full-on bar of it, but as it turns out, it was more like a nugget, small enough to fit in the palm of my hand, let alone my pocket. I snatched the thing before my mate could. No honor among thieves and all that, but then there was all this other stuff at the back too. Big envelopes looking pretty full and a little cardboard box with something electronic inside of it. We had no idea what was in there, but it wouldn't be in there unless it was expensive, right? So we pulled out all the envelopes in the cardboard boxes and opened them up. We went for the box first, thinking the electronics might have been worth a few bucks, but inside was just sort of a modern-looking thing. It felt pretty light, which usually means it's not worth very much, and even if it was, we wouldn't have the first idea as to who to sell it to, and so we tried the envelopes. I say we. It was my mate who grabbed the first and only one we pulled out of the safe, and I was still looking at the little plastic device, wondering if it had important information on it, bank details or something like that. He opened up the envelope, poured the contents out onto the floor, and then when a load of what looked like bank cards came tumbling out, my friend kneels down and starts going through them to see if there are any that haven't expired. I put the device back in its box and then started taking a look through some of the cards myself, only to notice the same thing he had. They weren't bank cards. They were ID cards. And they weren't just old IDs either. They were passports too. My mate said it out loud before I did that all the IDs were under different names. They had all the same picture, or at least pictures of the same older white guy, but the names were all different, even on the passports. Now, they weren't all from the same country either. They were mostly Aussie passports, but there was one from New Zealand, another from Argentina, and another from the United States, all with different names. I remember saying something about how the bloke must have been dodgy in some way, because no one has different IDs like that unless they're either a big fan of name changes or they're doing something they're not supposed to. And it wasn't long at all before we found out what that thing was. My friend was still going through all the passports and IDs as I opened up the second envelope. And then after taking a quick look inside using my light, I could see that there were photographs inside. I just couldn't make out exactly what they were until I pulled a couple out. And when I did, I dropped them like they were made of bloody asbestos. Now, I can't get into too much detail about these photos depicted, and not from lack of memory either. I can actually remember the only one I really looked at in incredible detail, even though I've since tried everything in my power to forget it. And that's because it showed a grown man and a small child doing something no adult and child should ever be doing together. I dropped the photos and swore like I'd just stubbed my toe on something, and then ended up sort of walking away with my hands on my head as I struggled to process what I'd just seen. My mate was confused for a second, asking what the matter was, and then he saw it too. I remember hearing a very muted but very horrified, "Jesus Christ." And then I turned back just in time to see him literally kick the photos away from him. I'd never seen him look that scared before. I really do mean scared too, not like disturbed or disgusted. He looked straight up frightened at what he'd seen, but I imagine he could probably say the same about me in that same situation. Because what we saw, it was awful. It was a bit chaotic after that for a minute or two, with my mate going into the guy's living room and putting a boot into the guy's TV. I had to tell him to cool it before one of the neighbors heard and called the cops. But then as we were wrapping up, stuffing our pockets with his watches and palm-sized electronics, a thought occurred to me. We'd left the envelopes, the photos, and the IDs scattered around the bedroom floor, so I walked from the guy's home office back into his bedroom and started shoving the pictures and some of the IDs back into an envelope. My friend followed me into the room a second later, and when he asked what the hell I was doing, he did not sound happy. I told him we had a chance to make some money. A lot of money. We just needed something physical to show a certain someone. When my mate just about flips his lid, saying that I must be out of my mind if I think he's going to let me sell that crap to someone, I told him to shut up and listen to me. Then, in a lot fewer words, I told him what I'm about to tell you. Around the time this all took place, there was a big-time Lebanese gangster in Melbourne, and he had a stake in quite a few enterprises, both criminal and legitimate. Now, this gangster had a nephew, one I'll just call Leb, who acted as one of his most trusted lieutenants, and this guy was a real enforcer type. Everyone was scared of him, and for bloody good reason too. The fella was an absolute psychopath, and he loved hurting people. But what I also knew is that Leb would pay very good money to know where the house was, especially after I brought him proof of who this guy was. My mate wasn't having it, because while he'd also heard rumors that the Leb paid bounties to any convicts who killed people who hurt kids while in prison, he also knew that the Leb hated junkies. But the thing is, I knew something he didn't. You see, I spent some time in juvie when I was a kid, and so did the Leb. And to look at us, you wouldn't think that we were about the same age, but we were. And not only were we about the same age, we'd been sent to the same detention center and at roughly the same time periods too. Juvie was rough, and I don't just mean that there were fights, gang feuds, crappy food, and even crappier beds. The screws were bastards too, but one of them was even bigger of a bastard than most. Now, he never ended up getting his hands on me, thank God. Maybe I wasn't pretty enough. But if this predator screw wanted you, he got you, and there was next to nothing any of the boys could do about it. And unfortunately for the Leb, he was one of the lads that this screw took a liking to. I don't know how many times he got him, probably only once after he found out who his family were, but a lot of you might be asking, well, why didn't he just tell his dad what happened and have the screw hanging from a lamppost? Well, to those people I'd say that you're sort of fundamentally misunderstanding the implications of being targeted like that. Boys don't want to talk about it after, let alone talk to their own dads about it. Anyone who even suggested it had happened ended up getting bashed by the leb, so by the time we were all grown-ups, it had mostly been forgotten about. But I hadn't forgotten, and if those jailhouse bounties were anything to go by, neither had he. So if he was willing to part with 10 grand for the scalp of some boneyard perv, boneyard meaning protective custody, then what would he be willing to pay for someone major on the outside? I mean, you, the reader, probably put it together faster than I did. The little modem thing was probably some kind of small portable server unit, something he could use to back up a website with hundreds of thousands of pictures and videos. The photographs, I think, were more personal, but all the identifications, they were what gave me that aha moment that this guy wasn't just some online pervert, but he was traveling to different countries under assumed names and identities to distribute and maybe create his own images of abuse. This bloke wasn't just some monster. He was freaking Godzilla. So the only question on my mind was how much his scalp might earn me with the leb. I knew he'd want it, but getting to him would be another thing entirely. And by that time, I had just over 50 hours to do it before the bloke came home, realized that he'd been rumbled, and did a runner, at which point, the information I had would be worthless. Admittedly, the first time I tried to approach him, it was a clumsy effort, and that's putting it kindly. I was out and about trying to score, so I'd have junk for the effort to come, when I just so happened to see him out and about getting lunch with his crew. Not wanting to miss the opportunity while it was right in front of me, I ended up running across a busy street shouting his name, and then before I even really got close, he told me to screw off before he aired me out, and did it so angrily that I knew I'd fluffed my chance. Not that a public place was even nearly the right place for a conversation like that, but the point is, I dropped the ball. The next thing I tried was approaching a cooler-headed member of his crew to see if he'd pass a message along for me. But then, the only way that I knew how to do that was through a nightclub that he ran security for. He didn't so much oversee the club's security as he did the sale of pills and baggies, but again, the problem was getting to him. After fairly recognizing I was a scumbag junkie, a member of the club's door staff stopped me from entering, but after pleading and persisting for longer than I'd care to admit, the guy relented and said that he'd call his boss. But when the leb's associate came downstairs and saw some scruffy-looking addict standing in his nice shiny club's doorway, he wasn't happy. Now, I tried to keep it short and sweet, so the first thing out of my mouth was, "I've got a business proposal for you." But that just made him even angrier. He practically dragged me down the street, away from the lights of the club and into the dark, saying I had to be dumb as a bag of ball sacks to bring business to his front door. I mean, fair enough. I probably should have turned up earlier and banged on the back door, but since I was busy scoring, I couldn't show up until I did. But anyway, the leb's associate isn't best pleased with me to start off, but at least now I can talk to him because he's marched me down the street a bit. But then here's where I really messed up, because zipped up in my jacket was the envelope full of IDs and photos. I thought he might want to at least see the envelope, just so that he'd know that I was for real and it wasn't just some scam I was trying to pull. But as you can imagine, the fact that I brought that stuff to his club had him simmering with the kind of anger I can only describe as volcanic. I could see him struggling to keep himself from kicking the crap out of me in the street. Doing so would bring heat down on him, which would bring heat down on the leb too, and that's the only thing that stopped him. He said if he ever saw me again, I was a dead man, and then he walked back to the club and walked inside. 2 swings, 2 misses. As you can imagine, I was shattered. I only had about 30 hours left by then, and I was quickly running out of options, so the fact that I'd mishandled 2 of them, let's just say that I wasn't taking it very well. I needed a fix, and I needed it badly, but I also knew that spending time nodding out under a bridge probably wasn't the best use of it. It also wasn't a good idea just walking around with a bunch of child abuse imagery zipped up in my jacket, because if I was caught, I'd probably get more time for that than the heroin. And so, with all that going on through my head, I made an executive decision. I was going to head directly to the leb's house, get inside somehow, and talk to him directly. Pretty much anyone who was anyone knew where the Leb lived, and even though he lived in one of the nicest suburbs in Melbourne, his place made all the other homes look like dollhouses. It was in this big compound with high walls and a solid electronic gate at the front, not a barred one. The house was a floor taller than everyone else's, but the top had these big panel glass windows, almost like a watchtower so we could look out over the city and see who was coming. But I couldn't have that. I couldn't have anyone see me coming or I'd never get inside. And so I went right around the back of the place, out to this little strip of bushland where the back wall was, and then I climbed a tree, lowered myself onto the top after scrambling along one of the thicker branches, and then dropped down into the Leb's backyard. It was about 2 o'clock in the morning by that time, so very dark out and very quiet too, as I crept through this big, beautifully tended garden. I kept my eyes peeled for any security on patrol, but then, as I'm creeping towards the pool, I look up, and there on the other side, sitting in a lounge chair, is the Leb. He hadn't spotted me, and I obviously didn't want to scare him either, so the only thing I could think to do was stop creeping, stand straight up, and then walk really slowly along the path until I was lit up by the pool lights. And then once I'd done that, I said his name to get his attention. When he heard me speak, he didn't jump. He just very calmly stopped puffing on what looked like a joint, and then turned to me and spoke a soft greeting in the form of, "Oh, it's you." He was as cool as a cucumber, not remotely scared or concerned, even when an almost total stranger was standing just a few feet away from him. I could have had a knife, a gun, or anything, but he just sat there eyeing me up almost curiously before asking me, "So what can I do for you then?" I started explaining I had some information that he might be willing to pay for. Info that would be dear to him, as I put it. It might sound bizarre, but after searching for him high and low, when it finally came time to talk, I could barely get the words out. I could barely bring myself to say crap I needed to, and I tried and tried, beating around the bush until suddenly I couldn't anymore. A member of the Leb's personal security team suddenly walked out of the back door, blowing on a hot cup of something to cool it down. It was actually quite comical looking back on it because when he appeared, the Leb suddenly cut me off with a sort of, "Excuse me, mate," and then turned to the bloke with a hot cup of coffee and said, "Bloody hell, Lenny, what the F am I paying you for, mate?" He then gestured to me, and Len put his cup down, and then as much as I tried to accelerate the explanation process, it was too late, and within seconds, Len had me in a chokehold. When Len asked what he should do with me, the Leb basically said, "Kill him. Do it nasty too. And then dump him somewhere public with a sign stabbed into him. Everyone should know what happens to a junkie that breaks into my house." And as I was being dragged away by Lenny, the security bloke and one of his mates, I sounded like I was stark raving mad. I was shouting about photos and passports and burglaries in the club, and none of it made sense. And then I remembered something. Back in juvie, the Leb had a nickname. I won't say it, but I remembered it, so I said it, and I said it loud. When the Leb called out for them to stop and let go of me, I felt a wave of relief wash over me, the likes of which I'd never experienced before and haven't experienced since. I could tick off all the cliches like feeling weak in the knees or breaking out in a cold sweat, but for me, it felt like God just winked at me, saying, "You're all right, mate. I've got you." I turned around, absolutely shaking, then was finally able to take the envelope out of my jacket, tell him why I was really there in just half a dozen words. "I got a predator for you." The Leb sat me down as he peered into the envelope. He didn't take any of the photos out, but he saw them, and all I remember thinking was, he's not scared at all. But then again, it wasn't the first time he's seen it, if you know what I'm saying. He was way more interested in the IDs, and like me, they're definitely what convinced him that this guy was like a major figure and not just some small-timer. Also, none of the addresses on the IDs were the one we burgled. There had been some with that address, but I'd removed them so as not to give it away. The Leb asked about it too and said that he could just try all those addresses until he found them, But I promised him that wasn't the case. And while I wasn't after a heap of cash in exchange for my services, a generous enough amount would most definitely loosen my lips. I obviously didn't quite phrase it like that. I was so frightened that I was monosyllabic, but I did think that I made a very persuasive argument in my own special way. The only trouble was, the Leb didn't see it that way at all. I remember him going very quiet when I started talking about money, a tried and tested negotiation technique to try and force me to lower my price sort of thing. I hadn't actually named a price, but his attempt to sweat me worked anyways, and I ended up proposing a split. A bit of money now, and the rest when my info comes good and he bags himself a predator to string up or burn or God knows what with. But like I said, the Leb had other ideas. We'd already had a little catch-up after I'd used his nickname from juvie. He wanted to know how I knew it, what my time had been like there, and how I'd been doing since. And that's how I got a first-hand taste of his hatred for junkies. He very openly said stuff to the effect of, "How could you have let yourself go like that?" And to be honest, I didn't really have an answer for him. He was visibly disgusted by me, and to be honest, I can't blame him for that either. But the juvie connection meant that I'd secured an audience with him. Yet although he'd looked through the envelope and decided he did want the guy's address, he didn't want to offer me a single cent for it, and instead, he proposed another trade. Give him the address, or die. It was a very simple decision if I'm being honest. Now, I'd like to say that I tried to bargain with him, or that I gave him any kind of pushback at all, but I was in no position to bargain, not after sneaking into his yard looking like I did. And so I did. I told him, and I didn't lie either. There was really no point. If the Leb wanted me found after sending him to the wrong address, he'd have me hunted down and skinned. And so I told him the truth and then left with nothing. I mean, I didn't end up with nothing. I still had my gold nugget, the cash from pawning the watch I stole, and a bag of brown to get me through the rest of the night. But my genius plan to make thousands of dollars had fallen through completely, and all because I was too desperate and too stupid. If I'd have had more time, then maybe I'd have been able to pull something off, but it didn't matter by then anyway. And as I'm sure you'll agree, I was lucky to still have my life. Life went on as normal after that for a while, at least as normal as it gets for a semi-functioning heroin addict whose life is slowly falling apart. And then one day, I'm out on the hustle when a big black car pulled up next to me, and after the window rolled down, the driver told me to get in because the Leb wanted to speak to me. I didn't say a word in argument, I just did as I was told, partly because I think I kind of knew what was coming, or at least I was hoping for it, but mostly because I didn't have a choice. I was driven somewhere subtle. I won't say where, but there was the Leb, and he looked strangely happy to see me. This was obviously on account of what I'd done for him, and by his own admission, he was only that frosty with me back at his house because there was a chance that I could be lying to him. Junkies are scammers. It just comes naturally to us. We lie to make money, we lie to keep secrets, and sometimes we lie just for the hell of it because who cares, you know? But in my case, every word I told him was true, and when he sent his boys over to the address I'd given him, they saw it all for themselves. When he got the word, the Leb had them camp out in the bloke's house until the next morning, when the guy was due home. And then after he walked inside, totally oblivious to what had been going on back in Oz, they nabbed him. The Leb told me he lasted for days before his heart finally gave out. I wasn't kidding when I said the Leb was a psycho, and the whole time he's telling about it, he's laughing and doing little impressions of the guy as he's being tortured. Now, I'm not a squeamish person either. I mean, you don't get many squeamish junkies at all, really, but even I was thinking, bloody hell, mate, as he's telling the story. Yet regardless, he was very happy that I'd gone to him with the address. Very happy. But not just because he'd had the chance to get a little bit of payback, but because he got his hands on that bloke's computer. He paid some computer guy to go through it just in case there was anything on there that he could use. And that's when he finds a list of bank details, all belonging to the people who'd paid for pictures and videos which showed those images. It wasn't even so that he could nab all the ones living in Australia either. He had someone send blackmail emails to anyone who lived abroad, and they netted about $100,000 in the last week alone. It reminded me of a line from the Bible that I actually once heard, and I looked it up so I could get it spot on. It says, "Whoever has will be given more, and he will have in abundance. Whoever does not have, even what he has will be taken away from him." It was my score. I took all the risk, but all I got was a gold nugget, while the Leb got to kick off an entirely new enterprise that was clearly making him megabucks. But then I didn't end up with just a gold nugget. And while that would have still been a great thing to walk away with on its own, the Leb saw it fit to reimburse me for bringing him the address, instead of just washing my hands of the whole thing. I won't say exactly how much I was given, but let's just say it was enough to keep me afloat for quite some time. I'd like to say that I spent it wisely and used it to get off of drugs and back onto my feet, but I didn't. I got clean in the end, but that was many years later. And while there's some stories from my time on the streets that I'll never breathe a word of for as long as I live, there's others I'm not quite as ashamed of. And having a hand in that scumbag monster's death is one of them. My grandpa came over to Cuba from Spain in the late 40s after the war ended. And although Spain wasn't a part of it, he grew up hearing all about it on the radio at the hotel that he worked at. You see, just because Spain didn't take part in World War II, they didn't exactly escape that period unscathed. They had their own civil war in the mid-30s, and it was a really bad one too. The country lost a lot of good men, and from all over as well. So when all was said and done, there just weren't enough good workers available to fill all the jobs. And that's how my 13-year-old grandfather ended up working as a bellboy in this fancy Madrid hotel. It was a real old-fashioned setup, both in the architecture and the job description. And my grandpa was a live-in bellboy, and that's half the reason that his mom pushed him to apply. She loved him plenty, at least that's what he told me, but she was also a war widow who could barely afford to feed any of my great aunts and uncles, who were in some cases considerably younger than my grandpa. And so off he went, from this little village just outside Madrid to one of the city's fanciest hotels, and from what he told me, it was like going from living in a hut to living in a palace. Now, even though he lived in the staff quarters where conditions weren't nearly as nice as the guest rooms, he got to do stuff like sleep on a featherbed with pillows, take hot showers every day, and eat at least 2 sit-down meals, one in the morning and one at night. It was a quality of life his mother never could have provided him. And so while he missed his mom and siblings very much, Grandpa said such luxury was easy to adjust to. His quality of living might have improved dramatically, but his bosses worked him hard for the privilege, and as a bellboy, he had to do a little bit of everything. Grandpa said that he didn't mind working hard. He was used to that. He said the only really downside were rude guests who treated him and the hotel's other staff like something they found stuck to the bottom of their shoes. They had all kinds of fancy people from all over the world staying there, diplomats from the Americas, royalty from Europe, as well as many, many members of the Spanish aristocracy. But no matter where they were from, or who they prayed to, or how they made their money, my grandpa said that they could always be divided into one of 2 categories, the kind and the a-holes. And the man from Lisbon most definitely fell under the kind category. Grandpa said that one morning in the summer of 1940, a very smartly dressed Portuguese man checked into the hotel. Grandpa could tell that he was Portuguese from the way he spoke Spanish, like his accent, I mean, and from the way he dressed, and he seemed either very wealthy, very important, or both. He introduced himself as Mr. Felix, said that he'd been staying in Madrid until some business was concluded, and then my grandpa was given the job of taking his bags up to his room. Some guests would simply watch as grandpa struggled with the heavier bags, but Mr. Felix insisted on taking up the heaviest one personally. He was strong and gentle and smelled of expensive cologne, and then once his services were no longer required, he slipped my grandpa a few pesos to say thank you. That was only the second or third time Grandpa had ever received a tip from anyone, but he assured me that Mr. Felix's generosity wasn't the only thing that made him so popular. He was gracious with all the staff, and he was generous with compliments, and he had a way of making you feel at ease, even though he looked like he might be the prince of such and such place. Mr. Felix was staying indefinitely, much to everyone's delight, since he didn't quite know when his business in Madrid would be completed. So he was still a guest of the hotel when a delegation of German scientists arrived from a Berlin university. They were there to meet with a group of Spanish scientists, with discussions taking place in the hotel's conference room, and although my grandpa had absolutely no clue what they were talking about, it seemed like they were some very smart people. They'd spend all morning in the conference room, taking a short lunch in the hotel's restaurant, and then return to the conference room for more of that fancy science talk that my grandpa couldn't understand. But then in the evening times, even if they all went out to dinner someplace in the city, they'd always return to the hotel bar for brandy and cigars. Mr. Felix also liked to hang around the hotel bar after dinner, and with him being such a friendly, sociable kind of guy, he gets talking to all these German scientists about who they are and what they're doing in Madrid. Apparently, Mr. Felix was not only a talented pianist, but he was quite the party animal, at least for his day anyway, because within a few hours of drinking and puffing on cigars, he had them all gathered around a piano, singing songs and laughing together until late into the night. Mr. Felix made a phone call as the night wore on, and then Grandpa said maybe 30 minutes later, a car full of beautiful ladies showed up to have drinks with the scientists. Now, he said it was the wildest party he'd ever seen in that old hotel bar. Nothing raunchy, just drinking and dancing and what have you. But inevitably, when the party was over, and such is the way of the world, some of those young ladies just so happened to accompany some of the Germans to their rooms. Maybe an hour or so goes by, and my grandpa used to work the night porter shift sometimes, and he's sort of sitting in the lobby trying to stay awake when he hears a scream. He and this other member of the hotel staff go running upstairs, only to find one of the young Spanish girls out in the hallway, sobbing her eyes out and nothing but her delicates. The scientist that she'd been with had carried on drinking while back in the room, and then, after walking out into the room's balcony, had started serenading Madrid's sleeping citizens. His lady friend tells him to come back to bed and that he'll fall over the balcony if he's not careful. She said he spun around on the spot like he was about to start singing to her, but then after leaning back on his little spin a little too hard, he lost his balance. He fell back, hitting the railing so hard that the momentum just carried him over, and then down he went, all 4 stories, but not quite to his death. After his fellow scientists rushed to the man's aid, they found that he was still alive, but he was barely hanging on. Grandpa heard that they rushed him to the hospital, but then they put the guy on a plane so they could fly him all the way back to Germany and to one of their top brain surgeons they had there. It was the most distressing thing to happen to the hotel for quite some time, and my grandpa assumed that that'd be the end of their conference. But then, I guess, having the kind of clinical minds that they did, they decided the conference had to continue even if they were a man down. From what Grandpa can remember, the mood in the hotel bar that night was pretty somber. There were brandy and cigars as usual, but instead of toasting the conference, they drank to the injured man's health and to his speedy recovery. Mr. Felix soon joined them, professing his heartfelt commiserations upon hearing of the man's terrible accident. Then, after taking to the piano, he led the Germans in a rendition of a popular song from their homeland, which made them all remember it fondly. Those scientists came to love Mr. Felix just as much as everyone else at the hotel did, at least until the final night of the conference, when something my grandpa experienced became part of the scariest event of his entire childhood. Like I said, he used to work as the night porter sometimes, mainly to give the usual guy a rest from working the night shift all the time, and he was working it on the final night of the scientists' conference. Now, since it was their last night together, and seeing as it was almost a whole week after their friend's accident, the scientists saw fit to throw a little party in the hotel bar. Naturally, Mr. Felix was invited to join them, and for a second time, he summoned a car of beautiful young women to drink and dance with the German and Spanish scientists. Mr. Felix was the life and soul of the party, and upon the bar's closure, there was a great deal of handshaking and thanks exchanged between Mr. Felix and all the scientists. Then once all was said and done, they retired to their rooms. Grandpa said that there was a great deal of warm feeling in the air, but even so, he couldn't help but feel a little wary. The last time the scientists had partied like they did, one of them had gone tumbling over a balcony, so as quiet hours began to creep in on the hotel's upper floors, my grandpa decided to go walking the halls up there just in case anything happened. He said it was up on the 3rd floor when he heard something like a glass falling off of a table in one of the rooms. He stopped and listened, heard what sounded like a window opening, but then all went quiet again. Grandpa said he breathed a sigh of premature relief and exhaled it just in time to hear a much louder commotion coming from a room downstairs. And as quiet as he could, he rushed back down to the 2nd floor and down a hallway to where he'd heard a similar sound, like something falling from a table. It wasn't quite loud enough to wake the other guests, but my grandpa sure heard it, so off he went, fearing someone might actually be hurt. Well, someone was, because no sooner does he get to the end of the hallway, but the door to the room opens, and out steps Mr. Felix. Only this time, and the way my grandpa put it still sends chills through me, it was not Mr. Felix. He looked like him. Heck, my grandpa said he even smelled like him, but from the way he moved and from the way he looked back at him, my grandpa could tell it wasn't Mr. Felix anymore. It was his whole demeanor, like he'd taken off a mask of his own face, and it scared the hell out of my 13-year-old grandfather. Oh, and that's before he saw the bloody knife in Mr. Felix's hand. Grandpa said that he'd been scared to death as it was, but seeing that knife had him running through the hotel hallways until he found a service closet to hide in. From the way Mr. Felix had been looking at him, Grandpa said that he was convinced that he'd hunt him down and that he'd hear his heavy footsteps coming up the hallway any minute. But he didn't. There was just silence for what seemed like hours until he heard the sound of the other night porter who'd come looking for him. Apparently, the other guy liked to take naps on shifts, so Grandpa really was hiding up there for about an hour before the other guy came looking for him, and that's when the crap hit the fan. 2 of the German scientists had been murdered, one on the 3rd floor and one on the 2nd. The police were called and they cordoned off the affected rooms while staff kept the guests calm, but there was no hiding what happened for long, especially not after the room belonging to Mr. Felix was found empty. The police searched high and low for him, but he was nowhere to be found. They put up checkpoints on roads surrounding Madrid as well, in the hopes of cutting off his escape, but no one fitting his description was ever stopped. Police at the border between Spain and Portugal were alerted too, and they must have kept a particularly close eye out for anyone named Felix, but they never did find that man from Lisbon. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. Officially, Mr. Felix was some kind of thrill killer who'd murdered the 2 German scientists for nothing but the thrill of it, after having befriended them over the course of the previous week or so. Police thought that he might well have had a hand in the accident which took place earlier in the week, perhaps via the girl who'd been staying in the injured man's room. But obviously the focus was on the 2 German scientists who had had their throats cut while they slept. It wasn't just 2 random guys. The 2 murdered men had been the head of the delegation, along with his personal assistant, while the guy who'd fallen from his balcony was said to be the delegation's most brilliant scientist. Grandpa said that in the aftermath, he heard people talking about how angry the Germans were, and that someone high up in the Spanish government had been summoned to the German embassy to explain the situation. But by then, they had the story straight. Mr. Felix was some psycho con man who'd wormed his way into the scientists' trust before he killed and robbed them. Totally random, totally unexpected, nothing they could have done about it. But that wasn't true at all. You see, the first 2 people in Mr. Felix's room were the grown-up night porter, the one who liked naps, and a Spanish police officer. The cops knew it was that delegation of German scientists that had been affected, so they were all well aware that, depending on what they found, the murders could turn into a diplomatic crapstorm of epic proportions. And so naturally, they were very interested to know exactly who Mr. Felix was. He'd left all his Portuguese identifying papers with him, his passport, his travel papers, even an insurance policy filed under that same name. But Mr. Felix was not the name of the man who had been staying in that room. No one would ever know what his real name was, but the man left a clue on the desk of the room he was staying in, one that gave a pointer to his true nationality. And the moment that Spanish police officer realized what it was, he snatched it from the desk and told the night porter not to breathe a word of what they'd found. Well, he did breathe a word of it, though not for a long time after, for fear of what the police might do. And then when he finally told everyone, there was no denying it. The man calling himself Mr. Felix had left a king's shilling on the hotel room's desk, one minted in London, England. The man who'd acted so naturally and so convincingly as a Portuguese gentleman, the one who'd so brutally murdered those German scientists, had been a British spy all along. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday night. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, LetsReadSubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. There's a new bonus content video out right now. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All the links are down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.